Ukrainian forces hitting back harder against the Russian-backed troops in the south. Is this the counteroffensive that Kiev's been telling civilians that it's preparing for?
You could hear shooting, but then you could also hear grunts and people like fighting to the death.
What happens when just 25 men force one of the world's largest militaries to defend its own homeland? In Bryansk, a Ukrainian special unit crossed the Russian border, and suddenly Moscow had to scramble artillery, rocket systems, and helicopters, not to take new ground, but to fight deep inside its own territory. This wasn't about seizing land. It was about proving Russia's shield could be pierced. The question is, how does a raid this small change Russia's entire strategy for the war? Stick with us, because the answer shifts the battlefield map itself. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So did you click the subscribe button? Great. Thank you so much. Now back to the video. 25 men stepped across the Russian border, armed but few in number, moving into Bryansk as if it were just another patrol. At first glance, it looked like a minor raid, a limited push by a small Ukrainian unit intent on testing defenses. But what followed transformed that tiny formation into a force that redirected thousands of Russian soldiers. Moscow had assumed the frontier was safe, assumed that its border regions were beyond reach. The men who walked in proved otherwise, and the Russian response revealed just how fragile its sense of security really was. The raid began quietly, with the Ukrainian detachment slipping across the line into villages on the Russian side.
Extremely rare to get an unvarnished account of what it's like at the tip of the spear as Ukraine battles Russia's invasion.
Their goals were never about holding ground. They moved fast, striking lightly armed targets and creating confusion about where they actually were. For local residents in Bryansk, hearing gunfire echoing so deep inside their territory was shocking. For Russian officers, it was more than an irritation. It was a symbol. Ukraine could take the fight into Russia itself. The Kremlin suddenly had to treat its own soil as a battlefield rather than a sanctuary.
It is one of the most daring and devastating Ukrainian attacks on Russian troops since the start of the war.
This is where the scale mismatch became striking. On one side, a handful of fighters moving with speed and secrecy. On the other, a military with hundreds of aircraft, vast stocks of artillery, and one of the most massive armies in the modern world. Instead of brushing aside the intrusion with ease, Moscow scrambled everything in reach. Attack helicopters lifted off within minutes, sweeping low over tree lines to hunt raiders who were barely visible. Rocket artillery systems moved into position around villages meant to be safe havens. Entire defensive belts, designed for battle in Ukraine, had to be shifted inside Russia to counter a force smaller than a single company. The sheer panic in the response told its own story. As reinforcements poured in, the impact rippled across frontline regions. Units that had been stationed near Donetsk, where Russia was pressing attacks, were suddenly ordered back toward the border.
Ukrainian forces hitting back harder against the Russian-backed troops in the south. Is this the counteroffensive that Kiev's been telling civilians that it's preparing for?
Defensive artillery allocated to Kharkiv was redirected north, weakening Russian positions in ongoing operations. For weeks, Moscow had concentrated on offensive movements deep inside Ukrainian territory. Now, instead of focusing its strength there, it had to thin its lines to guard against another incursion, one that might strike a different stretch of border at any time. The shift revealed a structural problem, defending a door that was never supposed to be forced open. The contrast could not have been sharper.
Any conflict in the past 70 to 80 years, this war is not sustainable for either side.
Russia fields one of the largest armies in the world, measured not just in numbers, but in the vast spread of its hardware. Yet here it was, reassigning valuable troops and machines to chase down a group smaller than most police squads in a major city. A microscopic action had produced a strategic distraction. That is what Ukraine wanted. The raid was not about raising a flag or holding checkpoints. It was about exploding the myth that Russia's homeland was untouchable and showing ordinary Russians that the war could spill into their neighborhoods. The psychological shock mattered as much as the military drain.
Different account claiming at least 7 people were killed. Ukraine is hailing it as a victory as it tries to drive back Russian forces.
That has now become a thing of the past, and this war is now in a very different and a very difficult sort of a terrain.
Moscow had built its strategy on the assumption of border security. Troops could be concentrated in Ukraine because the frontier with its neighbor was thought to be stable. Yet the Bryansk raid shattered that assumption instantly. Suddenly, helicopters thundered across skies that had long been calm, and villages heard the pounding of Russian rocket artillery against their own soil.
The occupiers have already felt very well what modern artillery is, and they will not have a safe rear anywhere on our land which they occupied.
Relying now on these small infantrymen, groups of infantrymen that are penetrating behind enemy lines.
What was supposed to be an impenetrable shield began to look riddled with cracks. To Ukrainians, that was the entire point. Not to win land, but to force Russia into defending what it claimed was already safe. By the time the dust settled, the message was clear. Securing the border against even small raids came at a steep cost, one Russia could not afford without sacrificing strength elsewhere. The Bryansk incursion had uncovered a vulnerability that no amount of grand declarations could cover up. Moscow depended on an illusion of safety, and once pierced, that illusion devoured resources desperately needed on the front lines.
You could hear shooting, but then you could also hear grunts and people like fighting to the death.
I think the Ukrainians have been very, very effective at developing drone systems which are relatively cheap.
What Ukraine achieved with a couple dozen fighters was a realignment of Russian priorities, forcing it into a defensive crouch within its own territory. And this raises the question, if a small raid can cause such disruption, what happens when it's paired with deep drone strikes hitting targets far from the border?
Sites to carry out sort of massive armored offensives because of the presence of drones and the visibility that is provided.
Ukraine proved that strength isn't only about how many troops you have, but about where you make your enemy stand guard. A handful of fighters forced one of the largest militaries on Earth to defend towns it once considered untouchable. Russia now spends energy chasing shadows along its own borders instead of pressing forward in Ukraine. A shift that tells its own story about momentum.
We see Russia and Ukraine constantly adapting their tactics in response to rapid technological change.
Its victory in Ukraine is inevitable. This extraordinary operation shows that Ukraine is still in this fight.
If one raid can spark this reaction, what happens when larger waves combine ground raids with deep drone strikes? Viewers must ask themselves, is this just the first crack in Moscow's defenses?